Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ken Mayer. I'm from Boston, and I want to welcome you to this very interesting session, whimsically called It's Raining Men, Key Statistics for Engagement. And there are a number of really exciting presentations this afternoon. Each of our presenters has 15 minutes for this 90-minute session. We have 6 presentations. Hopefully they'll all finish early enough that there'll be time for questions right afterwards. If they finish and the questions go early, we can even have a discussion at the end. Our first speaker today is Sarika Patnasan. She's going to be talking about the impact of HIV combination prevention in men who have sex with men in Bangkok, Thailand. Sarika, thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunities to present our work. For these presentations, we estimate the impact of HIV combination prevention in sexually active men who have sex with men in Bangkok, Thailand. In 2014, Thai guidelines first recommend PrEP for HIV prevention. The Thai government pharmaceutical organizations produced the first locally made Truvada called Tino-M at about $20 USD per month. At around this time, the IPREX open label extensions started in Chiang Mai, Thailand. In 2017, the Thailand Ministry of Public Health launched a plan to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. There was a target to reduce new HIV infections by less than 1,000 infections per year. In 2018, Thailand Ministry of Public Health launched PrEP demonstration project for MSM, transgender women, and persons who injected drugs in many provinces, as shown in blue color in this map. There is a plan to have certain populations to access for free PrEP under the universal insurance coverage in 2019. There are limited data on the impact of PrEP in combination with other prevention strategies on HIV infections in Thailand. More data to show the impact would be beneficial to support this prevention approach by providers and policymakers. We assess the impact of PrEP and condom use by calculating the estimate number of new infections among Thai MSM in Bangkok using different attributes of adherence and stratified by risk behaviors. We use a deterministic model that was developed by Dr. Smith and colleagues and had been used to assess the impact of prevention interventions in the US. We modified this model to inform on the impact of in Bangkok and use 3 parameters from published data. The baseline parameters were the efficacy of PrEP based on the IPREX efficacy studies, condom efficacies based on 2 previous HIV intervention trials. This current model also includes information from the Bangkok MSM cohort study or the BMCS. This study was a 7-year cohort in Siloam Community Clinic that assessed HIV incidence and risk factors for the Thai MSM prior to the availability of PrEP. This slide shows the first parameters, the efficacy based on self-report adherence of PrEP. They found that a highly adherence or daily PrEP had a significant effect on HIV prevention. This slide shows the second parameters, the efficacy based on self-report adherence of condom. This analysis reports the effectiveness around 70% when condoms were always used by MSM during anal sex with HIV-positive partners. This table of the HIV incidence from the BMCS Participants of this study were MSM aged 18 years and older who report oral or anal sex with a man in the last 6 months. The study found that the young MSM who used drugs during sex, those who had group sex, MSM that report any receptive anal sex, and those that were living with a partner, living alone, or living with a roommate were at higher risk of HIV infections, as you can see in this slide. These are the results using the deterministic model. We calculate number of infections using independent assumptions. At the highest bar, when both PrEP and condom were in the never categories, the incidence rate is equal to the overall incidence rate from the BMCS, which is 5.9 per 100% years. Overall, the estimated number of HIV infections among 10,000 sexually active MSM in Bangkok were lowest among those who consistently used condom and were adhered with PrEP daily, as you can see at the shortest bar. Even with non-adherence condom use, there were less HIV infections with daily PrEP use, a reduction of approximately 400 infections for every 10,000 MSM. These slides show the results of stratified analysis by risk behaviors. On the left is the number of infections estimated at baseline, and on the right is the number of infections estimated if PrEP were implemented successfully among MSM who never used condom. We found that if we implement daily PrEP successfully to MSM who never use condom, targeting MSM who use drug with sex, MSM who attend group sex, and young MSM had the highest number of HIV infection averted. We have some limitations to our model. We did not include treatment as prevention in our calculations. We based our calculations with independent assumptions. For example, we did not assess interactions such as less condom use when using PrEP. The baseline rate from BMCS may be underestimated of HIV incidence, as some could have been condom users. Finally, we cannot present the confidence interval of the reduction due to its high variability. Our results shows the impact of daily PrEP and consistent condom use on reduction in HIV infections. Adherence for preventing HIV infection is critical. We demonstrate that targeting particular high-risk MSM groups could most benefit from these combination prevention strategies. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and being within your time allotment. So we have time for questions. Please come up to the microphone and introduce yourself. While people are thinking about questions, have you looked at STIs from the different cohorts in the past and thought about modeling what different scenarios might be in terms of STI incidents in the Bangkok PrEP cohort going forward?
I think because the assumption of this model is based on independent assumptions, which is the decision to take PrEP and condom is not related to each other. I think the better ways to make the model is more realistic is to flexible the assumption, because we know that in reality, they don't use condom at the first place. That's why they choose to take PrEP. So it means that, and it's impossible to ask them to use both condom and PrEP. So the way to make the model is more reflect to the reality is to flexible the assumptions.
Yeah, no, but my question is more, are you starting to look at, you know your levels of incident STIs from some of the prior cohorts, and then as you start implementing, looking at impact and thinking about that in relation to your overall program. So is that something you're adding to the model at this point? It's actually transmitted infections?
Oh, yes, and circumcisions also. But because we use the published data, but if we talk about the model that use the data, the real data collection, then we now start to have the cohort that we also provide PrEP to the young MSM age 8 down to 15. So we can assess the impact from the real data rather than from the deterministic model.
Great. Question here, please.
Microphone number 3, please.
Australia. There we go. A question I have is that the demographics of HIV within Thailand is probably different to my home in Australia. How does that impact the implementation of PrEP in Thailand? I suppose my question is that for many heterosexual Australians, Thailand has been considered a site of sex tourism. Would PrEP be beneficial beyond the gay community and into the heterosexual community as well? I'm just trying to work out the demographic of HIV within Thailand.
The demographic of the HIV in Thailand now, I think, is common to other places as well because the young MSM is the highest risk group. So we use the published data of Dr. Don Smith, the condom effectiveness. That study assess the condom effectiveness among MSM. So in this condom partner, and it's a self-report. So with that, I think we can apply to the estimator from Dr. Don published paper to this cohort because it's self-report and the efficacy of condom among the MSM when they assess with the discordant partner should be the same everywhere, right? Or maybe different should not so discordant, too different to apply. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Patanasan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Cáceres, and I will introduce the second speaker this afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Rendina, who will be presenting on changes in rectal STI incidence and behavioral HIV risk before, during, and after PrEP in a national sample of gay and bisexual men in the United States. Jonathan Rendina is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Hunter College, CUNY, and Director of Quantitative Methods at Hunter's Center for HIV Educational Studies and Training, CHEST. He is PI on several NIH-funded studies and has published more than 60 peer-reviewed papers on HIV prevention and treatment. Please.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to be here and to follow that talk about modeling the association between PrEP and condom use and some discussion about STIs. Here I'm going to talk about an observational cohort study that we have to look at changes in actual condom use and STI infection rates following PrEP initiation, as well as in some of the men following PrEP discontinuation. So obviously, I don't probably need to tell anyone in this room that PrEP is highly efficacious against HIV, but obviously does not prevent any other STIs. And as a result of that, there have been many, many debates about risk compensation and the impacts of PrEP use on condom use and other types of infections like STIs. And this is particularly true for gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men. There have been several recent studies that have looked at changes in STI infection as a result of PrEP uptake. However, the majority of these designs have been pre-post. So we've looked at PrEP incidence at one time point prior to PrEP initiation, and then at a time point like immediately following PrEP initiation, or just 1 point after PrEP initiation. And so modeling studies have suggested that PrEP use may actually be associated with a decrease in the overall incidence of STI infection due to the regularity of STI testing that occurs among people on PrEP, at least if providers are following the guidelines. So the aim of this study was to rely on an observational cohort study that just so happened to start shortly after the FDA approval of Truvada for PrEP in the United States. We followed these men for a total of 4 years, and we conducted within-person analyses of those who initiated PrEP to look at how changes in PrEP status were associated with changes in condom use and STI infection. So in particular, we're looking at changes in condomless sexual behavior with casual partners prior to PrEP initiation, while on PrEP, and after discontinuing PrEP, and we'll do the same thing for rectal STI incidence of gonorrhea and chlamydia. These data come from the 1,000 Strong cohort, which is a NIDA-funded cohort study of approximately 1,000 gay and bisexual men living across the United States. All of the potential participants came from a community marketing insights panel of, at the time it was approximately 50,000 gay and bisexual men, 22,000 gay and bisexual men. To be eligible for the study, they had to live in the United States and have a permanent mailing address within the United States where they could receive STI and HIV testing kits. They had to be 18 or older, biologically male and identified as male. They had to report being HIV negative or HIV unknown at the screener, and then test HIV negative at the baseline. And they had to report having sex with another man within the past year. So at every single visit, we tracked PrEP use. We asked them if they had never been on PrEP, were currently on PrEP, or had previously been on PrEP. We did detailed sexual behavior measures at each time point. And at each of the annual assessments, the participants completed a self-swab for rectal gonorrhea and chlamydia. And we collected these data at up to 4 time points for each participant. So the baseline visit, we enrolled a total of 1,071 men, and then you can see at the 12-month, 24-month, and 36-month assessments, we retained anywhere between 95 and 88% of that baseline sample. These are the sample characteristics. The sample was predominantly white. I should say that at the time this study was designed, it was designed to match the distribution of race and age within the MSM household census data that were available. And so that is a little bit of the reason why the sample was predominantly white, predominantly gay, predominantly well off in terms of education and income, and about a 50-50 split in terms of whether they were single or in a relationship. The mean age of the sample was 37 at baseline, but we went all the way up to someone who was 81 years old. This is what the PrEP use over time looks like in this sample. The baseline started in 2014 and continued into early 2015, and then from there we followed everyone up every year. So everyone was enrolled within a few months of each other, so both the assessment time point and the year are basically the same thing. We don't have some people who did their baseline in 2014 and others who did it in 2018. So as you can see, PrEP use increased steadily over the course of these years. We went from 3% at baseline to 8% to 14% and ended at 21%. And you can also see that we also saw discontinuation rising over that time point. Nobody had discontinued PrEP at the time of the baseline, which was 2014, and by the 36-month visit, we had approximately 5% who at some point were on PrEP but were no longer on PrEP at that visit. And so it's anyone who's in these 2 lower lines that is going to be analyzed for the purposes of these analyses. So we focus on the 313 men who reported PrEP use during at least one of their assessments in the study. For these 313 men, we have a total of almost 1,100 visits, which is a little bit more than 3 visits per person. We used GE models that were adjusted for race, partner status, and the year or the assessment time point to focus on number of condomless anal sex with a casual male partner, number of receptive condomless anal sex with a HIV status unknown or HIV positive casual male partner, and then the probability of receiving a rectal STI diagnosis during the at-home testing component. And for the sake of keeping things simple to see during the presentation, I'll just display the results as the estimated marginal means that are adjusted for these covariates. So jumping right in, this is PrEP status and number of condom-less anal sex. So the blue group are all of the individuals at their time points when they were not on PrEP and hadn't been on PrEP before. The red is all of the individuals at the time points where they were on PrEP. And the yellow is those visits where we had participants who had discontinued PrEP by that time. And what you can see here is that we saw almost 3 acts of condom-less anal sex during times when people had not yet started PrEP. That jumped up to about 7 at times when they were on PrEP and jumped down to about 2 at times after they had stopped PrEP. And these comparisons were statistically significant in terms of being on PrEP compared to both before PrEP and after PrEP. Zooming in to what is arguably the highest risk sexual behavior, serodiscordant receptive condom-less anal sex, we also see similar patterns here. However, it is important to keep in mind these are actual frequencies and they're not probabilities, even though they look like probabilities. So what we see is about 0 in both the time points when they were not on, in each of the time points when they were not on PrEP, whether it was before or after taking PrEP. And we see an average of about 1 receptive anal sex act with a serodiscordant partner during the time points when they were on PrEP. So statistically significant, clinically meaningful, but not a large number of acts on average. Finally, here are the probabilities of a rectal STI diagnosis. So we saw a prevalence of about 7% at the visits when people were not on PrEP. This jumped to about 10% during the times when people were on PrEP, and it jumped down to about 2% during the assessments after people had stopped taking PrEP. The comparison of the pre-PrEP time points to the on-PrEP time points was not statistically significant, so the 7% compared to the 10% was not statistically significant. And the comparison of the after PrEP visit was actually statistically significantly different from both the pre-PrEP and the on-PrEP time points. And so we actually saw a significant decrease in STI incidence even compared to the times before they were on PrEP for the visits when men were no longer on PrEP. So in sum, we saw a substantial increase in PrEP use over the past 3 years from 3% to 21% in this observational cohort. We saw that PrEP discontinuation was also rising with men moving off of PrEP up to about 5% of the sample at the final assessment time point. These within-person analyses with multiple observations before, during, and after PrEP that were within subject analyses did confirm prior research that has shown an increase in condom-less anal sex. And in this case, that includes serodiscordant condom-less anal sex. But we did not observe a significant increase in the risk of rectal STI infections with multiple time points that occurred while men were on PrEP rather than just a single time point that may have been shortly after PrEP initiation. These data suggest that after using PrEP, all of the forms of risk studied had decreased, which was an interesting finding in terms of men actually going below their pre-PrEP levels of risk at times when they were no longer on PrEP. With actually significant decreases in the incidence of rectal STI infections during those time points. Of course, the sexual behavior data in this study are self-reported, which comes with its own limitations. The STI samples were self-collected, which has been validated, but of course could have some of its own issues. One of the major limitations is that while men were on PrEP, the recommendation is that they get tested quite regularly, and so it's possible that these men had been diagnosed and treated for STI infections outside of the study, and so by the time we got to them with their annual STI test, that we no longer saw that infection. Motivations for both initiating and discontinuing PrEP were not modeled here, and so they may help to explain some of the differences that we observe. Some of our research with this cohort has shown that men decrease PrEP as a result of changes in their risk, and so these data would confirm that type of hypothesis. Prior studies using only one visit prior to PrEP and one visit after PrEP may have some inflated estimates of the risk of PrEP for STI infection, which may result from immediate exacerbations in risk levels that may start to decline over time as men are on PrEP for longer periods. So there may be spikes right after starting PrEP in terms of risk behavior. As men are trying PrEP for the first time, they may feel a sense of liberation in terms of their condom use, and then this may not return completely to baseline, but may decrease over time. We do need research to explore the mechanisms through which we might see these really large changes in condomless anal sex, but not such significant changes in STI infection. It's possible that this is the result of increased testing and treatment. It's possible that this may be due to changes in their sexual networks or other features of their partners. However, overall, these data suggest that PrEP appears to be serving its exact purpose for the men who use it. They are taking PrEP when they are engaging in high risk, and they are stopping PrEP at times when they are no longer at high risk. To me, I think that the HIV field is at an important decision point in terms of ongoing debates about biomedical prevention. Is it worthwhile to continue our debates about risk compensation if what this means may be a jump from 7% incidence to 10% incidence, considering that we know that PrEP has a really significant impact on HIV infection rates? It may be critical to stop focusing on the use a condom every time debate and provide PrEP and condoms as part of a multitude of prevention toolkit options that can be tailored to each individual's needs around sexual health. A one-size-fits-all approach has not really worked. We have seen HIV incidence spikes for a very long time until the rollout of PrEP, and we really need to meet people where they are in terms of their sexual health needs. Not everybody can use a condom every time or wants to use a condom every time. I want to acknowledge the many people that made this study possible, including our funders at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the labs that analyzed our samples, and of course our participants who volunteered their time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or maybe two questions, so please, number 5.
Yes, Dr. Will Cobbs, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center in Chicago, Illinois. I was just very interested when you looked at the race ethnicity for study inclusion. What was the source again for that? Because it seemed to be, as you said, predominantly white men.
Yes. Yeah, so enrollment occurred in early 2014. I believe that the stratification was based on the distribution of MSM households in the United States from, I believe, the 2010 data collection point of the census.
Oh, okay. So the follow-up question to that is, based on your attrition, did you see that there was a disparity with Black and Latino men actually, not going to the 24th or 36th month, or was there a disparity there? Did you do any data analysis to that regard, or?
So two things to that point. We ultimately did enroll an additional cohort of Black and Latino and multiracial men into the study. They're not included in these data because we only had 2 time points on them so far, because they were added during the 24-month time point. So we do, the cohort now has more Black, Latino, and multiracial men that will be available to analyze, but they weren't included in this just because of the number of time points we had at the time these analyses were done. The data that we have analyzed so far definitely have pointed in 2 different directions. One is that the Black and Latino men in the sample are actually much more interested in PrEP, but unfortunately the Black and Latino men in the sample are also much less likely to be on PrEP. So we definitely do see disparities in both directions.
Yeah,
sorry,
okay.
we have to move on.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Number 6, please.
Hi, Britt Scathan at UCSD. Thank you for this talk. I was wondering if you have any data on the types of partnerships, because the inclusion criteria seem to allow people who are stably housed, so I was wondering if they also were in more stable relationships.
Yeah, I mean, so we see a much higher rate of being in a relationship in this sample than we have in some of our higher risk cohorts. I will say that this cohort was not designed to be a study of risk in the traditional way. So we have some new cohort studies that are actually focused specifically on HIV seroconversion that have higher risk-related eligibility criteria. This cohort was designed to be less risk-focused and was a study about resilience, actually. And so these are more secondary data analyses of that population. So analyses with populations that are higher risk might be quite different.
Thank you. Very quickly, because we have just 2 minutes. Please go ahead.
Hi, sorry. Did you get a little bit more information related to individuals who had healthcare gaps or loss of insurance, and then also utilization of behavioral health services prior, during, and after when it came to everything from adherence to how they feel about life?
The vast number of men in this study had health insurance. I believe it was like 94% at the baseline visit, so they're very well off in terms of health insurance. I have a poster tomorrow about PrEP care, and so we only see that 1 in 6 of the men in this cohort who are on PrEP are actually receiving comprehensive PrEP management in terms of rectal STI testing, urethral STI testing, sexual behavior interviews, and all of that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much.
Is Carolyn Cooney, who is Clinical Policy Advisor and Analyst in the Office of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator. She's going to be speaking today about reducing the risk of male sex partners, HIV testing treatment, and VVMC in men in PEPFAR supported DREAMS projects.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for those really interesting presentations on PrEP in Thailand and the United States. With my presentation, we'll be shifting a little bit to sub-Saharan Africa and also looking more at program data from our PEPFAR program. As Ken said, I'll be presenting on this abstract, Reducing Risk of Male Sex Partners, HIV Testing, Treatment, and VMMC of Men in PEPFAR-Supported DREAMS Districts. So as we've seen from studies from CAPRISA and others in Southern Africa, young women are really at the center of the cycle of heterosexual HIV transmission in sub-Saharan Africa. We see that adolescent girls in their teens and young 20s often are infected by young adult men who are about 5 to 10 years older than them. These adolescent girls then age into young adult women who transmit HIV to their male peers, and this cycle continues. And this really helps explain why adolescent girls and young women are at a disproportionately high risk for getting infected with HIV. In fact, they account for about 75% of new HIV infections among adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa. As we work to control the HIV epidemic, we must address the unique and multifaceted HIV prevention and treatment needs of both girls and young women and their male partners in order to have the most impact. So recognizing this risk that young women face, PEPFAR announced the DREAMS partnership in 2014 with the goal of reducing HIV incidence of girls and young women in DREAMS districts. And this partnership has since expanded to be over $760 million investment in 15 countries over the past 4 years. Those countries are represented here. And one of the core principles of DREAMS is this implementation of a core package of evidence-based multi-sectoral interventions that meet the complex needs of women and girls and support them to stay HIV-free along with their families, their communities, and their male partners. And so as you can see from this diagram, girls and young women are really at the center of the core package, but it's also very intentionally designed to reach young adult men and boys as we understand their importance in the communities that these girls live in, as well as their relationships with girls and young women. And so I put in red here interventions that reach both girls as well as boys and young men in the core package. And I also just really want to emphasize this complementary funding that PEPFAR has invested specifically on scaling up voluntary medical male circumcision, as well as test and start programs for men in DREAMS districts, really focused on these young adult men who are often the male sex partners of adolescent girls and young women. So in taking a closer look at our program data and really recognizing the potential impact of these interventions targeting men and then preventing HIV infections in girls and young women, we set out to answer this question. Was there an increase in HIV testing, circumcision, or treatment uptake in DREAMS versus comparable non-DREAMS districts? after the first 2 years of the DREAMS partnership implementation. And so for this analysis, we chose 5 out of the 10 original DREAMS countries based on 2 criteria. One was that their PEPFAR geographic districting remained consistent over the first 2 years of implementation, which was 2015 to 2017. And they also had comparable non-DREAMS districts, which made us possible to do this analysis. So in selecting the original DREAMS districts, we looked at factors like HIV prevalence and incidence, as well as rates of teen pregnancy and girls' secondary school completion. So these comparable non-DREAMS districts that we chose for this analysis had similar characteristics. All districts, both DREAMS and non-DREAMS in this analysis, are also PEPFAR priority districts for programming and funding. And also of note, the non-DREAMS districts were either originally proposed for DREAMS and not selected due to funding, or have since 2017 been added as DREAMS districts, so they made for a nice natural comparison. So once we'd selected the districts, we then looked at the results for 3 key PEPFAR indicators from our program data. And we looked at the results for men ages 15 to 49. And those 3 indicators were the number of clients who were tested, the number of clients that underwent VMMC, and the number of clients that were newly initiated on treatment. And we compared the annual results from 2015 and 2017. And again, that's right before DREAMS started to after 2 years of DREAMS implementation, and calculated the percent change. And then we used a series of generalized linear mixed models to assess the difference between the DREAMS and non-DREAMS districts. So what we found was that there was in fact a significant positive difference between DREAMS and non-DREAMS districts in 3 countries for an increase in men newly initiated on treatment and an increase in men tested, and in 2 countries for an increase in men that were circumcised. But as we'll see in the next table, the results varied across indicators and across countries. So these are the results with 3 indicators across the top, again, VMMC, testing, and new on treatment, with the 5 countries down the side. And the percent change there is for DREAMS and non-DREAMS for each indicator. And again, that's the change in results, which is the uptake of these services between 2017 and 2015. You'll notice there are some positive percent changes and some negative, where in fact the uptake of the results in 2017 was actually lower than it was in 2015. And then the significance is noted for each indicator and country. And so you'll notice some variation, as I said. There are some instances where the non-DREAMS districts actually outperform DREAMS districts, such as the VMMC in Mozambique. And then there are some where there was not a significant difference between the 2, such as the new in treatment in Kenya. But overall, we did find this significant positive difference, especially for HIV testing and newly enrolled on treatment, for uptake of men in this age group. And these results are especially strong for the new on treatment, which is this area in blue right on the end, where all significant differences were found to be positive, with DREAMS outperforming non-DREAMS. And if we also look at Malawi as a country, all DREAMS districts outperform non-DREAMS. And in fact, for Malawi, the non-DREAMS districts had a negative percent change over the 2 years. So to get a better sense of the volume of clients we're talking about in these countries and districts, I pulled the annual results for the testing indicator in blue on the top, and then, treatment on the top, and then testing in red on the bottom. And so the lighter color in both represents the 2015 results, and the darker color is the 2017 results. And then I've circled here where there was the significant positive difference between DREAMS and non-DREAMS, as indicated on the last slide. And again, you'll notice variation in the results and in the volume of clients uptaking these services across countries and districts. If we look at the testing indicator, for example, you see that in Kenya, the DREAMS districts had a much higher volume than the non-DREAMS districts, whereas if we look in Zimbabwe, it's a pretty similar volume between the DREAMS and non-DREAMS uptaking testing. But interestingly, both countries, we found a significant positive difference, with a greater increase in men uptaking testing in the DREAMS districts than the non-DREAMS districts after the 2 years of DREAMS implementation. So a few limitations are that these results are based on our PEPFAR program data, and while that's a significant portion of the response in these countries, it doesn't take into account achievements from national governments and other stakeholders. We also didn't take into account differences in the overall population between districts. So moving forward, we'd like to address some of these limitations, including this point about the overall populations, as well as use some qualitative data to contextualize our results and really understand these differences better. We're also in the process of analyzing our results, focused more on the girls and young women themselves, and we'd like to analyze whether differences in the DREAMS results for girls and young women can be explained by differences in coverage of these services for young men, or if it seems that the interventions targeting girls and young women specifically appear to be having an impact. So to conclude, we found that overall in DREAMS districts, there was an increased uptake in testing and treatment, especially for men 15 to 49 years old compared to these comparable non-DREAMS districts. And we find these results very exciting in our PEPFAR program because we know that we need to reach more men and the right men with these high priority, high impact HIV prevention and treatment services. And it appears that the holistic approach of DREAMS, which includes a targeted focus on girls and young women, as well as their families, their communities, and their male partners, is correlated with an increased uptake of these services. And this puts us on our way to breaking the transmission cycle in these high burden contexts. I think it's also important to note the variation that we saw, which to me further emphasizes the need to work in a coordinated and multi-sectoral way to address the HIV prevention and treatment needs of men along with those of girls and young women together. And I'd just like to leave us with a reminder that it's essential that in our work that we meet these populations where they are and listen to their voices as we work to end this epidemic, set our priorities, and design our programs. So I'd like to thank my co-authors and our agencies, as well as the beneficiaries of these programs that we work in, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Cooney. We have time for a few questions. I'm curious if you have any insights yet in the non-DREAMS districts that seem to perform better for some of the metrics. Could some of that be because either national ownership meant that because they knew they were non-DREAMS districts that the national governments were putting more resources in for these programs? Or was it more on the other side that there were more structural issues in some of the DREAMS districts that still need to be overcome, local key opinion leader resistance to some of the programs like circumcision?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I think we're still in the process of really kind of understanding those contextual pieces, but I think it could be kind of a combination of what you said, as well as really looking at the coverage of these services going into the DREAMS implementation period. So those are all important things that we'll be looking at going forward.
One other quick question. Are you starting to map changes in incidents in relation to program penetration in some of the districts?
So as part of our DREAMS partnership as a whole, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funding some implementation science and impact evaluations of the DREAMS program over the first 2 years. And so the Population Council is one of the aspects of that, is looking at male partners specifically. And actually London School also is looking at incidence in girls, incidence changes. So that will be something coming in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sergio Dimande, who will be presenting on a profile of adverse events in a national VMMC program in Mozambique. Reduction in adverse events with a national scale-up, but 3 events require further attention. Please, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Sergio Dimande. I work at GPAG Mozambique as a monitoring and evaluation advisor. I'm going to present these abstracts in behalf of my colleagues. The presentation's profile of adverse events in largest voluntary medical male exclusion program in Mozambique. Those are the outline of the presentation. The voluntary medical male exclusion program in Mozambique started in 2009 with PEPFAR CDC support. We are now supporting Ministry of Health in more than 50 sites. Those sites include fixed, mobile, and temporary sites. We are operating now in 5 provinces. Mozambique has in 5 provinces. Those provinces shows in red. And most of our providers are mid-level nurses. Adverse event is an injury, harm, or anxiety outcomes occurring during or following male excision that would not have occurred if the client had not undergone the procedure. And those adverse events can also be caused by severe, mild, moderate, and severe. But in our program, we only report moderate and severe events. Also by timing, we report both natural and self-lines. It's important also to mention that adverse events in our program, it's good quality management and service provision. The main objective of this abstract was to identify adverse events, understand their profile, and monitor them in order to reduce potential risks involved in the male circumcision procedure. We analyzed our respective data from 2009 to 2017. We also assessed the number, type, and rate of adverse events that occurred during this same period. Also, we categorize our findings by age group, event type, and event severity. As we can see in the graph, we almost performed like over 700,000 male circumcised, and half of them are under 15 years old. The program has been implemented with an advance rate of 0.25%, and 9% of them were moderate and 9.7% were severe. And most common events, the adverse events were infection, hematoma, and excessive bleeding. This graph these two graphs are very interesting because as you can see, the age 10, the male under 15 years old and above are almost equal, 50%. But when we look at percentage of adverse events, male skins 15 years old, age old, are more likely to experience adverse events. We have taken some action to improve the management of adverse events. One of them was to reinforce the IPC special team in charge where monitor those practices. We also adapted and expanded screening tool for bleeding disorders. We strengthen hematose techniques. We reinforce counseling for post-procedure care, including parents and guardians. Also, we enforce compliance with notification of adverse events. One of action also taken that was very important was promotion of culture of transparency between our providers, because we reinforce that it's important to report adverse events, and reporting adverse event was not a measure of to be fear of. We also started implementation of automated DL reporting system, which included production by site and by adverse events. One thing we do every day in this program is to report the production daily. We have a group, an email group with more than 30 people that every day receive information of production by sites, also by if adverse events occur, also report in same day. So it improves the way we analyze the information. You see the targets of the program. To conclude this abstract, the adverse event rate was 0.5, and even is lower comparing what is seen in nature. Analytic correlation and monitoring of that helps to keep adverse events rate low because it allows significant cause and implement solution. The information is be complete and of good quality and must be shared between managers. Implementation of good tools for screening and prevention of events is very helpful, and relative simple corrective measures help control adverse events. Adoption of technology has to be adapted to levels of competence of staff. And thank you.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions, a few questions. So I think we have one in the first one, mic 4, please.
Thank you. I've got a question. Did you get some information about loss of pleasure after the circumcision? Or maybe added pleasure, I don't know.
Actually, we don't track this, but no one have told that have lost pleasure of being circumcised. Maybe what happened is when they come and they come for procedure after healing process, the satisfaction rate it increases because they are, for example, for those who are married, their spouses like to see men circumcised. So I think, yeah. So no loss of pleasure, no.
So, please.
Hi, I'm Silvia Kelber from JPIGO. Congratulations for the presentation. I wanted to ask if you know why boys 15 years older have more adverse events comparing to the others, if you have a chance to know more about that.
We don't actually we don't know the causes of what is happening, but maybe it can be lack of hygiene. Maybe it can be one of the reasons, because when are boys, their mother take care of them. So when they are also other causes can be also because men above 15 years old. Some of them are married, and maybe they can start, for example, they can start, maybe, I'm not sure about that, but maybe they can start sex before the complete process of healing. I think can be on some of the cases. We must start and see what will happen about that.
Okay. Any other question? If not, I think, thank you very much. Very good presentation.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Suzanne Maman, who is a professor of health behavior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she'll be discussing results from a cluster randomized trial to evaluate a microfinance and peer health leadership intervention for HIV and intimate partner violence prevention among social networks of young Tanzanian men.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present in today's session. I am going to present the results of a cluster randomized trial that I conducted in Tanzania with my colleagues who are based at the Muhimbili University of Health and Allied Sciences. So I'm presenting on behalf of the team there and the team at University of North Carolina. And it was a trial that we conducted in Dar es Salaam with social networks of young men. So I don't think I need to review the statistics and explain why women are disproportionately affected and impacted by HIV. We've heard it many times at this conference and other conferences. We also know that HIV prevalence of intimate partner violence is something that about 1/3 of all women experience in their lifetime, and it has devastating health implications, both physical health as well as mental health. Given the norms that dictate gender dynamics within relationship and give men control over the terms and conditions of their sexual relationships, we really need to find ways to effectively engage young men, in particular, in HIV and IPV prevention. We also know that social networks provide a context for shared peer norms that are important to understand, and also provide an opportunity for social influence to happen naturally. And interventions that have leveraged social networks have shown that you can have an impact on behavior that you can also sustain over time. So with that background in mind, we set out to do some formative research in Dar es Salaam to identify social networks of young men who are at risk for HIV and IPV perpetration. We used a place methodology, which is a venue-based sampling method, to identify these spaces where young men were socializing with their networks. And what we found were that social networks of young men spent time in spaces called camps, which I'll explain more on the next slide. When we went into those camps and talked to the young men in those spaces and asked them what it was that they wanted, they talked about a need for more training in business and capital to start business enterprise. And so in the formative research phase of this work, we went into those spaces and worked with 3 of those camps in 1 ward of Dar es Salaam to pilot an intervention that combined microfinance with peer health leadership within networks. And what we found were that men were able to successfully engage in both the microfinance and were able to identify peer health leaders who were willing to be part of a training on peer health leadership interventions. So camp-based social networks, what we found regarding camps that they're naturally occurring social networks. They socialize in spaces throughout the city, like the ones pictured here on this slide, which are usually open spaces that the young men claim. They often mark those spaces with some sort of billboard that names the site as theirs, as their camp. Young men report that they go into these spaces daily and spend several hours with other young men in these spaces, often just passing time, but sometimes engaging in business enterprise or other activities together. So in the formative research phase, we identified 70 of these camps within 1 ward. They're durable social units in the sense that when we went and asked about how long they had been in existence, on average they had been there for 8 years. The average number of members within these camps are about 32, and they're disproportionately male members, so about 85% of the membership is male. When we asked the young men who were in the camps how long they had been part of these camps, on average men belonged to the camps for about 5.5 years. They were also fairly organized networks, so they typically had some leadership structure to them. They had identified a chairperson, sometimes a secretary, and a treasurer. So they were very functional and somewhat formal networks of young men. So we took the results of the formative research and we implemented a larger trial, which is named Vijana Vijueni, which in Kiswahili translates roughly to young men in their hangout spaces, in this case camps. We conducted a cluster randomized trial to evaluate the microfinance and peer health leadership intervention. The primary outcomes of the intervention included prevalence of STIs. We looked at chlamydia, gonorrhea, and trichomonas, and past year perpetration of physical and/or sexual violence. The secondary outcomes we examined were sexual risk behaviors and past year HIV testing. And the hypothesized mediators that we explored were inequitable gender norms and hope. To identify and select camp for the implementation, we expanded our work to 4 wards of the city, and we did a similar mapping exercise where we identified 205 eligible camps. And to be eligible for participation, camps had to exist for at least 1 year, had to have between 20 to 80 members, and had to be assessed as safe by our study staff. Due to the close proximity of many of the camps, we clustered contiguous camps and selected clusters using a probability proportionate to size procedure. We then selected a simple random sample of 60 camps within these clusters and randomized them to intervention or control. This is the consort diagram for the trial, which shows the flow of participants through the trial. I just want to highlight that we enrolled 1,249 men within the 60 camps, and the intervention was rolled out for a period of 2 years. And our final assessment, which occurred 30 months after the launch of the intervention, we had an 80% retention or higher in both of the arms. Just a little bit more detail on the intervention itself. So the microfinance component of this, we offered all men who were in the intervention camps the opportunity to participate in the microfinance. And 524 of those men attended the initial 5-day business training. We implemented that training with a microfinance partner in the city. And the trainees who deposited $5 in savings, paid a loan fee, formed a group, and had an approved business plan were eligible for the initial loan, which was roughly $100 US. If the individuals were successful at paying back that loan, they were then eligible for a second loan of $185 and a third loan of $285 US. We conducted weekly repayment sessions with the young men, and the borrowers were encouraged to add $1.25 to savings at each of these weekly sessions. We conducted every 6 months we conducted booster training sessions as well to address some of these issues we were seeing around the businesses and the repayment. The peer health leadership component of the intervention was designed to leverage the fact that these networks had some leadership structures already. We asked the young men in the camp to nominate peer health leaders, and they did that. We invited 170 of those nominated leaders to participate as peer health promoters. We invited them, and they participated in a training that focused on leadership, gender-based violence, HIV, and it also focused on communication and social influence. We then encouraged the leaders to go into their networks and use some of the skills that they had learned around communication and influence to talk to their peers about HIV and gender-based violence. We also asked these leaders to maintain records of the numbers and types of conversations so we could track what those look like over time. We also had booster training sessions every 6 months with the peer health leaders. In terms of the analytic methods for the trial, we did attrition analysis using logistic regression to test for differential loss to follow-up across the arms. We used an intent to treat approach, and all models accounted for clustering of participants within the camps. To examine the intervention effects on our primary and secondary outcomes, we used a modified Poisson regression approach to estimate relative risks. And we adjusted estimates controlled for baseline levels of outcomes, demographics, and duration of camp membership. We used mixed linear models to examine the intervention effects on proximal intervention targets while accounting for the clustering. And then we did supplementary moderation analysis to examine whether treatment group effects were moderated by things like ward, age group, SES, and camp cohesion. This is a sample characteristics at baseline. So on average, men were 26 years at baseline. The majority of men, roughly 58%, had a primary school education or less. Most of the men in the sample were not married, though the majority, about 90%, were sexually active. I do want to point out the intervention participants had reported more past year sexual partners and were more likely to have current sex with a partner at baseline, and we controlled for that in our analysis. In terms of our results, we found no significant differences in STI prevalence or IPV perpetration across the two arms, nor did we see differences in some of the sexual risk behaviors that we were examining. What we did see was more HIV testing among men in the intervention arm. There was a significant difference in HIV testing. When we look at the hypothesized mediators, what we also saw was the intervention reduced inequitable gender norms. So men in the intervention camps were reporting more equitable gender norms by the final assessment. So in summary, we were able to successfully engage and retain networks of men in this multi-component intervention. There were no significant effects on the primary outcomes or the secondary STI risk behavior outcomes, though we did see significant increase in HIV testing as well as a reduction in inequitable gender norms over time. This is the first trial, to our knowledge, targeting social networks of young men in Africa to demonstrate an effect on norms and behaviors. Working with social networks can effectively address some of the low uptake of HIV testing that we've seen over time. And the trial itself has important implications for how we can identify and engage men in these urban African settings in prevention interventions that address both HIV and IPV. I just want to acknowledge the funding for both the formative research phase and for the intervention trial itself comes from the National Institutes of Mental Health. Thank again the participants who gave generously of their time, as well as key study staff and trainees who participated both in the implementation as well as the evaluation of the trial. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maman. There's time for questions. It was obviously a very well constructed, thoughtful, and ambitious study, and I suspect the team was surprised by the outcome. I'm curious, do you have a sense of mobility, and perhaps the construct of the camp is not as hermetically sealed, and perhaps there's just much more other ways that the men are interacting that diffuse in this urban setting?
We've obviously reflected a lot on the outcomes. I think it might have less to do with the organization of the camps and the cohesion within the camps. I do think they are what they are in terms of what we found. It's possible that the interventions that we targeted for these camps weren't the right interventions. It's also possible that we didn't follow things for long enough. So we saw some change in norms, and we've seen from other studies, if you let that play out a little bit longer, we might actually see a change in behaviors as well. Yeah.
So I'm Andy Gibbs. I'm from the South African Medical Research Council. Fascinating, because also one of the first studies to look at economic empowerment for men as well, kind of through a rigorous trial. So I wondered what were the microfinance outcomes, and whether you looked at intensity of the kind of gender social health intervention, because that seemed to be quite a light kind of touch intervention.
So the question is around the microfinance component specifically?
Plus the intensity of it, intensive nature of the kind of gender part of it, and whether you looked at whether that had a mediating effect.
I think the one thing with the microfinance, we saw a large number of men participated in the initial training, but a relatively small number of men decided to finally uptake the loan, which surprised us initially. And over time, more men did participate in the microfinance, but it's possible that this type of intervention isn't the right intervention for men. Or that men, one thing when we did go in and do some qualitative work to try to understand the low uptake, one of the things the young men talked about was they wanted to see it work successfully with other people before they themselves engaged in it. So they may need more time or more training to really buy into this type of an intervention, even though it was generated from their own demands around trying to bring them more capital and training. And the peer health leadership piece, again, I think it works successfully in this type of a context. It's something we're more familiar with and we were more comfortable delivering. And we were pleasantly surprised that the peer health leaders were willing to engage and return to the trainings over time. So that's something we felt was implemented well in this trial. Yeah.
Please.
My question goes to why do you choose microfinance as a key issue in your project? For example, why don't you provide vocational training for this man instead?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the microfinance, there are two reasons. The first reason is in the formative phase, it was something that the men said they wanted. So in some ways, we used it as a way to engage them, to bring them into the intervention. But also we thought about other trials that have used microfinance with women and some of the theoretical ways they think about that may have influenced women's behaviors. And we thought about microfinance potentially being able to influence men's time horizons. So being able to think about their future somewhat differently, which might then encourage them to engage in less risk behavior today. So there was also a theoretical way we were thinking about the microfinance influencing behaviors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Maman.
Thank you very much. So our last presenter will be Marian Solangon. She will be presenting on an integrated biological and behavioral surveillance, IBBS, survey among men who have sex with men in South Sudan. Currently, Marian Solangon is an M&E officer of the Migration Health Unit of the IOM at South Sudan. Previously, she worked for UNAIDS for the Health Headquarters Gender Unit of UNAIDS and worked as a project officer of the Development Academy of the Philippines as well. Please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for staying until the last presentation. This research is of a different context to what has been previously presented by the 5 previous presenters, mainly because it deals with an ongoing humanitarian crisis, a context of emergency setting in South Sudan where the dearth of data is mainly the challenge for HIV programming. This integrated biological and behavioral surveillance survey among MSM in South Sudan is the first of its kind, where there's no or limited knowledge on MSM in the country. The outline of the presentation, I'll take you very briefly through the background, the objectives of the research, the methodology which we conducted, some of the key findings of the research, and the recommendations thereafter. The official epidemiological data of South Sudan states that the HIV epidemic is characterized as low and generalized, with pockets of high concentration among key populations. Key populations account for at least 63% of new adult infections, according to the modes of transmission survey conducted in 2014. As mentioned on other key populations, there's limited HIV and AIDS data. Specifically for MSM, there's none at all. So we relied on project data. Some partners have key population programming, and most of that were used for the background or the literature review. Homosexuality and sodomy is illegal in South Sudan. The South Sudan Penal Code criminalizes this behavior, and this criminalization and the sociocultural conservatism in the country is the biggest challenge in conducting research as such. Also, of course, the security situation brought about by this affects the environment for conducting such researches for key populations. We had 3 objectives for the research. Mainly, we wanted to understand the MSM community and the factors that predispose the population to a greater risk for HIV and other issues concerning it. And we wanted to obtain a baseline prevalence data for HIV and syphilis for 6 of the sites that we conducted the research in. This is not representative of the whole country because we conducted it only in 6 sites. Finally, we also wanted to provide recommendations for evidence-based programming. As mentioned, the MSM community in South Sudan is a very hidden population. Therefore, regular population-driven sampling could not be used. We used non-probability sampling, and most of our respondents were mobilized through going through FSW networks. We know that there's an important synergy there between key populations. We used a standard behavioral questionnaire. Also, we conducted qualitative methodology. And for the biomedical part of the research, HIV and syphilis testing. We were able to get 165 respondents, and this might be a very small or low number to some, but given the fact that before the research, program data pointed to only 53 or estimated 53 MSM in South Sudan, reaching 165 in 6 sites is already a big achievement. Again, data collection proceeded in last year, November to December 2017, in 6 sites. So we go to the findings, the first of which is the respondents' nationalities. This is an important finding for us because there was a prevalent belief among stakeholders before the research that the practice, MSM were mainly foreigners. They were not South Sudanese. But we found that 92% of the respondents were in fact South Sudanese, and 8% came from the neighboring countries. Only 8% came from the neighboring countries. The age of the respondents, about 85% were from 17 to 28 years old, meaning these are young, economically viable, and sexually active age group. In terms of definition of MSM, we were looking for those who had anal or oral sex for the past 18 months with a male partner. And the type of relationships we interrogated were casual and regular relationships. So we found that for those with casual partners, 92% had only male casual partners, and 8% had male and female casual partners. Now, this is important because we can see that sexual practice of MSM straddled same-sex and heterosexual relationship, and this is particularly important in HIV programming and advocacy programming for MSM. We also found that 37% had sex with regular male partners, but more importantly, 63%, or the majority, had sex with casual male partners, which can be seen as high-risk sexual behavior, especially if it's unprotected, which we will go into later. Condoms and lubricants access, the universe of our respondents knew what a male condom was, but less than 50%, 42%, have seen lubricants before. So that's a very low number, and 89% know how to access condoms. But in terms of usage, condom use during anal sex, only one-third of sexual practice, they were regularly using condoms, just one-third, both for casual and regular partners. So two-thirds of sexual practice were unprotected or used very irregularly, condoms very irregularly. So this is high-risk sexual behavior. As for sexually transmitted infections, 89.7% has heard of STIs before, 12.1% has had an STI in the last 12 months, 68% has ever visited a health facility, but what's important to note is only 4.5% has ever disclosed that they are MSM due to stigma, fear of discrimination. We calculated the GAM indicators and for MSM, and for the prevalence rate, we have 3.3% among MSM. So that's higher than the general population, which is at 2.7%. Incidentally, the syphilis prevalence is also at 3.3%. And as mentioned, condom use at last high-risk sex is at 30%. In conclusion, there's definitely a need to develop and implement national MSM policy framework. And just recently, South Sudan has finalized their national guidelines for key population programming, and MSM is fortunately mentioned. There's also a need to strengthen advocacy and awareness about MSM health issues among all stakeholders, specifically because we also faced security incidences while conducting the research, in spite of having all the necessary approvals from the government. There's also a need to improve targeted behavioral change communication among MSM to reduce risk and promote safer sexual behavior. We also need to address observed stigma and discrimination against MSM among some health practitioners, and we recommend for regular IBBS to be conducted in the country. As a last note, I'd like to acknowledge that this study was funded by the Global Fund through UNDP as the principal recipient, and of course, with coordination with the Ministry of Health and South Sudan AIDS Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions for for your presentation and maybe for others as well. So let's start with this presentation. So please.
Hi, this is Sergio Torres from the London School of Hygiene. Thank you for that. That's really valuable research. I just had a question about if you had any issues or challenges in obtaining ethical approval, given the context in South Sudan and how you overcame those challenges.
Okay. We sought ethical approval, and the challenge was there was a bit of delay in acquiring that ethical approval, but how we overcame this challenge is that we involved the government in the research at the inception. So they were the principal investigator of the research, so that helped us a lot. But eventually we got it, so that's it.
I have a question actually. How has your research been received by the country? No, and is it going to lead to any change? What would you say?
All right. We were able to present the initial findings in April, and surprisingly they were very positive about the results, mainly because it will inform our programming on HIV and AIDS. And these security incidences that we face, obviously there's much need for advocacy before we actually have programs to reach MSM, and that is going to happen in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes?
Oh, please, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm Hao Chuli from China. Thank you for your presentation. It's my first time to listen to a presentation about data among MSM from South Sudan. Well, because it's the first presentation about South Sudan for me, so I'm curious about what kind of cultures about MSM, this kind of behavior in the local settings. In your project, before you're going to conduct this project interventions in South Sudan, do you have any knowledge about the local cultures, including the values among men who have sex with men?
Yes, thank you. Before we conducted the research, that was given big consideration actually. The choice of sites that we conducted the surveys in were representative of different cultures across South Sudan. One of the factors that was also considered was HIV prevalence. In the northern part of South Sudan, closer to the Sudan border, it's mainly Muslim population. But across South Sudan, there's social and cultural conservatism. In fact, a lot of the FGDs that we conducted and just trying to get a hold of the MSM, some of our respondents or how we were able to mobilize the respondents, a lot of the communities were in denial of the existence of MSM in South Sudan. In fact, I mentioned that they believe that the practice is from foreigners. So that's why this study is very important in just proving that they exist and that they need to be addressed. Their health needs to be addressed, being that they're key population also in South Sudan considered.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes left, and so we would like to ask if there's any question remaining for any of the other speakers, please.
This question is for Dr. Rendana. My name is Robert Saquatan. I'm from Chicago. I've been working recently with a local health department in implementing a PrEP program, and also working with medical students who do PrEP education to providers. And I was just wondering if your survey found or assayed how difficult it was for the men in your survey to actually find providers that were knowledgeable about PrEP or testing guidelines for men on PrEP.
So at every time point, we ask a range of questions that get at the PrEP cascade. And so one of the questions we ask at every time point is whether men have or know of a provider who would be willing to provide them PrEP. And so we have those data. We have a paper from, I believe, the 12-month data time point that looks at the different steps of the PrEP cascade. And so we find a lot of drop-off along those early points in the cascade for this particular cohort, where we lose about 50 men in terms of just either being unwilling to consider PrEP or not thinking of themselves as candidates. We lose another 15 or 50% or like 50% of those who weren't lost at the prior step in terms of either not having any intentions to start PrEP or not having a provider that they know of that would be willing to provide it for them.
Thanks, because just anecdotally, I found that I've gotten a lot of referrals from patients who say that they just can't find anyone in their area who are knowledgeable. And even the student I'm working with basically was inspired to start this education project because he came from Ohio and had to actually go from where he lived to a major urban center in order to find someone who would be willing to treat PrEP. And he felt very stigmatized during the entire process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the purview paradox speaks to that in terms of, HIV providers not really feeling comfortable providing for prevention services and primary care providers not feeling like they know enough about HIV medication to prescribe. And so I think that is definitely a problem, particularly in areas outside of major cities like New York or San Francisco.
Yeah, so I think the burden is on primary care providers, and I include myself in that number, and also as a gay man, to basically advocate for basically the major professional societies like American, basically the American College of Physicians and such, or societies in other countries, to include that as part of their base education for primary care providers.
Yeah, I mean, I think care of MSM in general is really lacking. We see very low numbers of men who are receiving even annual rectal STI testing, which we know is a major issue for this population.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, just...
well, I have a question for the presenter from City University of New York. In your presentation, you're saying that in your 36-month follow-up, you still have more than 88% retention rate. It seems quite high. Could you please explain more how you can do that?
So, we obviously don't know exactly what leads to the incredibly high retention that we have. But one of the features that I think does matter is the fact that we recruited from, at the time, what was a marketing panel. And so marketing panels tend to have access to people who are research engaged and who complete their marketing related surveys regularly for compensation. And the compensation for this study was also pretty good and escalated over time to keep people engaged in the cohort. So combined, I think that all of those are the primary features, as well as, there was a lot of, I wasn't a PI on this study, but there was a lot of work in terms of branding the study to be really positively focused on like the good aspects of being a gay or bisexual man in the United States, and trying to like really focus on strength-based branding of the cohort.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This has been a session on key statistics for engagement. We've heard about combination HIV prevention, an observational study on PrEP, VMMC, microfinance intervention, and violence against women, and biobehavioral surveillance. I think we are slowly moving. I mean, the presentations are showing that we are moving. Maybe things have been a bit slow so far, but we are already moving, and we hope we'll keep moving. and showing more progress in the next few years. So thank you very much for your participation here, and thanks very much to the presenters as well.